Hi everyone. Is this on? Can you hear? Yep. Welcome to tonight's first in the series of the Spring Mitchell lectures. It's kind of nice to say the word spring, in an optimistic fashion. I'm Henny Rennes, the chair of the architecture programs at the school. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, I would like to just remind you that next week's lecture will be in the Rubloff Auditorium. It's an industrial facility, and we are partnering with the Visiting Artists program in bringing them to the school. All of the subsequent and other lectures that will happen during the spring will be in this space, in the Neiman Center. The one on March 5th would be Jenny Sabin from Cornell, followed by Joshua Stein, who is our Mitchell visiting professor in this academic year. That's March 26th. And then Eric Bunger, Gillian Russell, and Onkar Kular from Sweden will talk during April. All of those lectures will be in this space. It's really a pleasure to introduce Paola to you tonight. Paola is the founder of a Borderless Studio, an urban design studio in Chicago. She had a little blurb on her website text that you must have seen. It states that this talk will be a reflection through the practice of design as a platform and a tool. The word tool, I think, is kind of critical. To convene and create spaces to think collectively about the future of places, communities, and cities. Paola's work within Borderless Studio with her partner and her collaborators really work very closely with the idea of exploring across boundaries, of really exploring the intricate nuances and discrete questions that one discovers when you work with community and with structure and agency. Paola is a really valuable faculty member at the school and in our department, and a truly valuable member within the City of Chicago's culture of asking design questions and asking tough questions about the urban future of the city and the region. Paola has also recently been appointed, I think, by Mayor Lori Lightfoot as, what do they call it exactly, the Chicago Mayor Commissioner of Chicago Landmarks. And more importantly, I think, as part of the Cultural Advisory Council in Chicago. So please welcome Paola. We look forward to your speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Buenas noches. It's really amazing this to be the first lecture of the year. I usually try to lecture. I try to make myself available to different schools. But this is the first time I actually give a lecture in Chicago. So I'm really excited that it's at home, that it's in a place that I spend a lot of time and energy and passion with my students and with fellow faculty members. So I'm just very thankful. And I thought what would make the most sense to talk about tonight. 2020, everyone in multiple circles has been reflecting on the decade, what we're going to do in the next 10 years and so. I'm going to, in retrospect, and I'll get that in a little bit, Borderless has been in the make for 10 years. The work that you'll see, that I'll share tonight, it's a snippet of it, but I'll try to share with you what are projects, what is work, what are reflections in which I have had opportunities to work and think about what a practice that connects communities to design might look like. Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter what city, doesn't matter what neighborhood, doesn't matter what culture. The power of design, I believe in the power of design as this driver to transform lives and spaces, but only when we design with. And I think that has been something that I've taken very seriously. I reflect often about how in architecture practice, we are often trained in a transactional mindset. versus a collaborative mindset. So a lot of my students who are in this room tonight know that I push very hard for collaboration. It's hard, it's not easy, it's not an easy pathway, but it's much more rewarding, and it's much more fruitful, and it generates much more productive conversations. I'm an admirer of Jane Jacobs. I didn't discover her until I came to the U.S. to pursue a master's degree in urban design. I was trained in architecture in northern Mexico, in a town and a home called Chihuahua. And when I discovered the way that she talks about cities, I was really, really impressed with the way her writings are accessible. My mom could understand anything that Jen Jacobs would be describing about the city and the dynamics that we care about. So I take to heart this quote that talks about cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And these are my stakeholders. I work for them, with them. And I think really hard. I spend a lot of time thinking how they can be involved in processes that are sometimes only limited to very small groups of people. And I think also I've been trying to frame a practice that is very rooted in values. Sometimes, in architecture training, we talk about concepts, we talk about strategies, but it's really important for me in the way that I speak about my work to talk about values. The values that Borderless tries to bring together or to always have at the top of any conversation are around publicness. Just because my career started in government just out of chance. My second job was working for the government in Mexico. And I learned very quickly how I was not able to communicate with a lot of the community members I was working with. And architectural language can be a barrier. And I started working really hard on just expanding my language in order to think broadly about ways of communicating things that I care about. And openness, it's because I think we're also trained in a way that everything that we project, everything that we put out in the world should be perfect and should be done and should be completed. And I believe it's really, really fun to work in a way that you just are exposed to public critique all the time, and your work becomes richer, your work becomes more malleable, more flexible. So this idea of transparency and openness is a very important value in the way that I work. So a lot of the work that you see is kind of half complete, half baked, half cooked, however you want to call it, but that's very intentional. And lastly, this idea of civicness, I think if we understand that everyone has a responsibility towards the places and the communities that we have the opportunity and we are fortunate to live in, we have a role as citizens. So each one of us has the power, has the capacity to make change. It's what are the tools that we're bringing to the table? What are the skills? What is the energy? So it's this idea of giving back, but it's also like giving forward. So that's where my hometown is. I'm between Chi-towns, if you haven't noticed. So someday I started bringing this to my partner at Borderless, also my husband. We're going to found a Chi Lab. Stay tuned for that one. But it's this idea of thinking across scales, geographies, and cultures. And I mentioned this before, but this idea of also of how do you position the idea of values? How do you think about process? And how do you, instead of thinking of only the outcome, how you start thinking of values and processes driving the design of frameworks for projects. So since I founded Borderless in 2016, and I'll explain a little bit, it goes back a little more. I had the opportunity to work in all the cities. Most of them Midwest, so I've been really fortunate to travel and work with many communities, many neighborhoods, many of them shifting populations. East Coast, even in the border in Brownsville. But it's one of the two goals of the studio, Borderless as a practice, is this idea of cultivating collaborative design agency. And in order to expand that idea, the main focus that I've been thinking about is how do you connect communities to design processes? If at the core of the issue of social equity is this idea of social justice, it's the idea of power, who gets to be in the room, who gets to be part of the process to take decisions about our cities, then we need to spend time, we need to spend energy designing that process and making that process available. It means it should be at the pace that people can be part of it. It should be in the place where people can be part of it. It should be in the language. And this is not about Spanish or English. It should be in the language that is accessible. And thinking, of course, I was trained in architecture. I love design. I love architecture. But also, I was trained as an urbanist, as an urban designer. So I think in a broader scale of infrastructure. And on top of all that, I'm a resident of any community. So I'm very invested in how do we think of these processes to activate public life. So this is a work in progress. This is Borderless has been 10 years in the making. Not physically, but here. And I just highlighted a couple of projects that I want to talk about today. Some of them have influenced others. Some of them have been borrowed ideas in some capacities. But I just wanted you to keep in mind, this type of practice doesn't just emerge one day. It's something that, this project started when I was in grad school. We put a little exhibition on a little wall that the school gave us, and we thought, okay, we don't have any money as a student group, but we want to talk about publications in Latin America. We want to talk about Latin America and North America and how Mexico is its gateway. So it started as a little exhibition in the hallway of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. More importantly, we wanted to create a conversation about the things that we want to talk about. And that's very key. When I was studying in grad school, there were no studies in Latin America whatsoever. Everyone was talking about China. Everyone was talking about Middle East. We were a few students back then, but I wanted to talk about Latin America. That was the place that I wanted to practice. And this was our opportunity to bring to the conversation the things I wanted to talk about. So as designers, I think we have a responsibility to change the narrative. And we have the most powerful tool in the world. It's called design. And we are able to redefine the conversation. This is the landscape that I grew up with. The town that I show you, Chihuahua, is 250 miles south of El Paso, straight south, if you're familiar with that region. But I crossed this bridge multiple times. If you haven't been there as a pedestrian, this is what you encounter, and you can see the fence area on the back. That's your walkway. The very vehicular-oriented environment, and this plaque. This is the most important thing that you see when you cross the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso. And I was just curious. I was walking one day, and what it was really interesting to me, it was the one piece of signage that the space had. Was about the International Border Water Commission. If these two countries had to agree on something, had to be about water. Very important element, right? So I started just reflecting on that. And my boss at that time, this is 2011, 12, started thinking about the Great Lakes as one region. And I was like, well, we also have that in the U.S.-Mexico border. The Rio Grande Bravo watershed has something similar. And started thinking in a broader scale. And then zooming in, understanding landscapes, mapping, of course. For those who know me, I'm a map nerd. I'm obsessed with mapping things because I think that's the way I find to understand territory, but also to understand connections across systems. And it's really fascinating what you can find these days with maps. So I just started mapping. And this was a way to see differently a territory I was, quote unquote, very familiar with. More mapping, we are mapping, ineligible mapping. This is about population. But it was giving me a language to talk about There was a lot of conversation. This is an abstract map of the border and population. Obviously, the west, San Diego, Tijuana, has the largest city. To the east, to the Gulf of Mexico, the smaller numbers. And I was just right in the middle, so I wanted to understand in which place was the town that I was growing in. Zooming in, looking at the city scale, again, trying to understand geography from different perspectives. These are all the cities that are border, and they are, they're the pairs. So I started thinking of what if we think about strategies for cities at the, that are more responsible, more responsive. Some of those boundaries are natural, such as the Rio Grande Bravo. Some of them are artificial, just as a political border. And more maps. So a lot of mapping. This is a map I created for a piece I wrote for a journal called Scapegoat a few years ago. And I wanted to understand if this signage was so important, I had to understand the politics, the history about water infrastructure in a city such as El Paso and Juarez. In addition to finding, where things are, the main lesson from that mapping was, it's projected that the city is going to run out of water by 2030. 2030 is 10 years from now. So the horizon, it's not super long. But also, the strategies that the cities had were completely different. With more resources and a military base in place, El Paso decided to invest 15 years ago in a desalination plant, which is on this side over here. More resources, obviously the implications of desalination, if you know anything about water infrastructure for desalinating water, the ecological implications of that are just unreasonable. Yet we are investing in the type of infrastructure. On the Mexican side, very different story. It was not about what are we gonna do about this water? It's how long are we gonna extend the pipes to continue extracting water from the aquifer. So these are all the aquifers, 23 wells that had been excavated over the last 50 years or so. There was no story about infiltration, stormwater management, like how are we going to fill our aquifers back? It was more like how do we continue this extractive way of using our resources? And it looks like that. A lot of our infrastructure has been obviously manipulated and intervened in ways that are almost irreversible. This is the actual border. This is what is left of the Rio Grande, which is that canal. So the prospects of all that research and all that was very complex for me. I was fascinating doing the information, but then how do I do something? What can I do? And I think that's often when I speak to a lot of colleagues, but also to students, like when the problem is so big, where do you start? What is worth investing in? And I started thinking, well, maybe I need to talk to people. Maybe I need to design a process that allows me to have this conversation on a larger scale. It's great that I know about this, but it would be greater if more of us get to know about these issues. So I started designing, this is a couple years later, I started designing a series of workshops in Mexico called Mapeo, which stands for mapping. And I wanted to work, this is my hometown. It's a city that it's in the middle of, it's a valley, but it's basically in the middle of a mountain with the mountains and the desert. So a lot of growth, but very interesting areas, like the one that it's highlighted, that it's on the boundaries, on the outskirts of the city. And I wanted to understand what were the implications, what was the process of urbanization. I had work in the government agency, planning government agency that I mentioned before. So I had known about this area being planned and formalized and urbanized, but we really never took a chance to talk to the residents. So I designed this process with 17 students. I designed a process where I thought, what if we bring, in Chihuahua, we have 5 schools of architecture. If you think you have a lot of schools in architecture in Chicago, try again. For a city of 800,000 people. And some are private, some are public. So I thought, what if I design a process in which students from a private school can come and work with a student of a public school, and vice versa? What if I design a workshop where students from journalism, which is narrative storytelling, can work with designers? It was almost an impossible task. Trying to just talk about this idea in Chihuahua, oof, you should have seen me trying. And then, through the phone, because I was living in Chicago. It happened. We made it happen for 2 years. It was about bringing excitement. All those institutions that are listed there helped me, their facilities, their faculty, their resources. But I was not interested necessarily in working only in their buildings. I was interested in working on the site. So a lot of our time, this was a boot camp week, was spending time with what I call our stakeholders, right? Understanding how they use the space. This area had recently invested in a community center, and it was about to be inaugurated. This is my favorite image. This is a courtyard space in between two buildings. And you see the fence. It was supposed to be just a space in between. It's a service space between two buildings. The kids were perfect. This is our football field. And by the way, we can actually go through those posts that are here. So people use spaces in ways that you cannot anticipate ever, which is fascinating. But also seeing like other economies, really thinking of other economies of scale, seeing how we design spaces, to be enjoyed only by a few. If anyone knows about designing a football pitch in Mexico, you have to get grades in there. So you're obviously gonna have a lot of population. But it was about conversation, really thinking in a productive way. This is one of my favorite images. We were working in that community center that I show you. And kids from the neighborhood were asking questions to the students. This was the audience. This was the crowd. These were just exchanging and really asking tough questions. So that series of workshops was a really good way for me to be an organizer. We're not trained to organize. We dabble, we learn in the bull ring, but I think it was the first attempt to bring 5 different universities, 3 government agencies, and another couple of nonprofit organizations to be part of this conversation. So we created a little video. I'm not going to play it all. I just want you to see a little bit of the feeling.
Toda esa línea de negocios, sí. Toda esa línea de negocios son de diputados, de que estuvieron en gobernación, y todos los han vendido. Mire, ese que está ahí, lo acaban de vender. Lo acaban de vender. Era de un hermano de un diputado. A mí me hubiera dado mucho gusto ver a todas las escuelas juntas y allí frente al Palacio de Gobierno. Porque eso es una protesta muy grande, que ya están hartos ustedes, los alumnos.
Usted como persona, ¿qué es lo que siente que más hace falta aquí?
Pues hace mucha falta que gente que haga una reunión, el gobierno, pues no sé si el estado, del municipio o del gobierno, una junta para decirle sus verdades, ¿sí me entiendes? Para que diga, no, mira, si yo vengo y te pongo aquí un jaripeo a toda máquina y reúne mucha gente aquí, ¿no te has dado cuenta tú que reúne, por no sé, 1000 gentes, reúne, grite, va, y los rateros allá en las casas? Sí.
This was a retail owner on the main commercial. Vistas del Cerro Grande es un barrio que se encuentra al sur de la ciudad, en esta zona conocida popularmente como Ranchería Juárez. Se conoce así porque es originalmente tierra ejidal. Esta tierra ejidal fue transformada y ocupada urbanamente, segmentada, convertida en cuadras, y la comunidad se organizó para proveer de servicios de infraestructura, de agua, de drenaje, acceso a electricidad de manera pues casual e incluso ilegal muchas veces. Esto, bueno, deja los huesos o la estructura base para el funcionamiento de esta comunidad, pero bueno, siguen teniendo una necesidad imperante de calles, de pavimentación de calles, de equipamiento.
En el plan de desarrollo urbano, con esta visión a largo plazo, se identifican como zonas con un rezago para poder abatirlas, para poder llevar estrategias puntuales en temas urbanos, en temas de recuperación de espacio público, pero también en temas que involucren a lo más importante, las personas que ahí viven, y que con esto puedan contar con las herramientas necesarias para progresar. Esa es la visión que se tiene de la zona de atención prioritaria a largo plazo. Si no se atienden estas problemáticas, puede ser muy riesgoso para el desarrollo de una ciudad. Lo estamos viviendo en este momento con las problemáticas de seguridad pública que tiene la ciudad, y es importante reflexionarlo, analizar qué estrategias son las que pueden generar un beneficio en las personas que habitan estas zonas.
¡Allá nos vemos! Hoy es el día, hoy es la fecha, hoy es el regio y colosal debut del espectáculo más joven de México.
So it's a longer video, but what I like to show is that all these videos are available online through Borderless website. And for me, it's important. I learned about the power of documentation too, and thinking of how can we tell the story of these places? How do we encourage other designers to be part of the walk, to walk the walk? And the video tells the story of how the students talk to other community members, but also it was interesting for us to record the feelings of the community members not trusting their government, who was doing the new infrastructures that they needed, right? So the need was a quote unquote just a perception of what they need, not necessarily engaging into a process. So fast forward a few years, I have been working at SOM for a few years, and I left to work with a group that artist Theaster Gates was putting together called Place Lab. And it was the first time I didn't work with only architects. It was an experiment. It was a place to bring social work, cultural work, architecture, construction, urban design planning, and real estate development expertise in a small team. It's a dream team, right? And we were charged with understanding what could be strategies to creating a network of cultural spaces in the south side of Chicago. Started with some of the development that the university had invested on the west side of Washington Park, now called the Arts Block or the Arts Incubator in Washington Park, and thinking of new spaces where Theaster had invested in buying real estate. And I think his most known project, and most of you have been there already, the Stony Island Arts Bank, was in very early stages back then. But this idea of like, what happens if you bring a group of people together and cultivate collective experiences, created public spaces, authentic spaces for public assembly. And this is something that, when I ask my students, what is the most memorable thing, or what is the most memorable building? This is for me one of the most memorable things that I heard Theaster say to his team. The problem is not a wealth gap, it's an imagination gap. And that stuck very close to me. One of my first projects there was create an exhibition for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, the first one, 2015. We were a venue, and I wanted to do something to just bring together different projects that were happening, and also just tell the story of how this place was being, would be incremental. Communities get really frustrated because they don't understand development process. So I think if we're more transparent and we use our pedagogical tools to share that process, being transparent and open, people start having conversations, understanding, with a better understanding of timeline, of budget, etc. So opportunity, an exhibition as an opportunity to create these multiple dimensions, meaningful and incremental content. So we didn't want to create content from day one. That was very challenging. Probably I won't do it again, but I still do it. Interdisciplinary collaborations, this idea, this concept, this value of neighborliness and community exchange, new partnerships and audiences, an artist meeting with a vendor across the street, an architect bringing their creativity to a vacant lot across the street, an old muffler shop being activated during nighttime. This is 55th Street in Washington Park on a Tuesday night. That doesn't happen every day. And bringing content that is incredibly academic. Back then, the Southside Movie Project, led by Jacqueline Stewart, was starting to get out into civic spaces. So we really wanted to put this content out in the community while having s'mores. So I like thinking of multiple scales because sometimes people relate different and see access, so like I can do that in different scales. So this exhibition was designed with an object, with an outdoor installation, talking about the story of a restored building. We really try hard, I try very hard always to enable collaborations or promote collaborations. So always thinking of who is a member in the community, who should be part of this project, what artists or designers are doing interesting things, how students and youth can be part of the conversation and the discussion. Designing with sometimes means, or often means, that you have to bring everyone in the process of designing when it's messy. I think being an art school, that's really great that we get to prototype often and before putting our work out into the world, but bring the prototypes to the city. Just, again, public critique, it's okay. The most feedback, the best, the better. So we put these objects in the middle of the street. I've always been a big proponent of bringing objects out, artifacts out into places that they don't seem to belong. This was very interesting. This pavilion was commissioned to Port Urbanism, and we engaged them very early in them trying to understand the relationship with the contribution of a performance and musical artist, but also how to think of structures that could be beautiful, bright, well-designed in the South Side. That's how it was occupied. The construction of the pavilion didn't meet the deadline, which was amazing in many ways because people were so intrigued by how this pavilion was being assembled that we were supposed to activate. And I thought that was so interesting because, of course, as architects, we wanted the thing finished at the end. But people found even more fascinating seeing the architects just rushing into putting pieces together, and they understood, oh, that's how you do it. I can do that. So this idea of, can we make things accessible or in a way that people understand how they can participate in that type of design? It was interesting to me. Materials that feel, very accessible. And it's always about bringing different collaborators for activating the space. This is Michael Patrick Aguiree, some of his students. The Bucket Boys, the installation was called the Restoration Room. Of course, we had to have Bucket Boys. And just bringing people out into the sidewalk. I think a lot of the events that the Arts Incubator had been inside the gallery. And this was one of the first times that we were activating the outdoor spaces, the sidewalks. And just finally on that, was telling the story of a building that was being under development a couple of buildings down. And telling the story of each one of these projects. We wanted to just document all these elements in this wall were appearing as the weeks were passing by during the exhibition period. and having everything being touchable, accessible. This is my favorite photo ever. Spending time in the gallery and things just being activated by even the little ones. So I came across, one of my colleagues invited me to collaborate in this project in Brownsville that I mentioned before. And that was the first official project, or one of the first official projects from Borderless. And this project has to do a lot of how, it's a planning project, but also has to do with how I've been reflecting on building the software. So how do we help people to think of process differently, how to engage with each other differently? And it's part of the nature of a lot of communities that they don't have physical infrastructure, right? They cultivate the social networks, but also I think as designers, if we understand better how to participate within that process that is already in place with communities, we do a better job responding with design to community needs. This project is in Brownsville. It's a former public housing site just on the border of Matamoros. This is the bridge where you cross to Mexico. And this is a 150 unit site from the 1940s. You can see the urban renewal area had touched downtown Brownsville and transformed these small blocks into larger scale blocks with a completely different typology development. Obviously, this idea of building in open space. It was a time to respond to sanitation, of course, and efficiency, but this was not designed for Brownsville. This is 90, 100 degrees in the summer, 60% humidity. Can you imagine living in spaces that are that compact and that low? So obviously it was a model, was a typology that didn't really belong to the site, yet it was constructed, and it lasted in very good shape for a long time. These are photos from 2016. So you can see there was a lot of care and very clean, yet some of those spaces will remain like that. No one will use them because this is the back of the houses and people didn't really understand how the spaces worked. Who belongs to whom? How can we activate, how can we have a presence in this space? But a lot of the population was also Mexican. A lot of the population also only spoke Spanish. So we engaged in a 2-year process, which was very, very a privilege. This project was part of the Choice Neighborhood Plans. In planning realm or in planning efforts, this was after Hope 6, which is the federal program to invest in redevelopment of public housing sites without having, in order to diversify and deconcentrate in poverty. So this is what we were confronted with, space that had very, very limited accessibility. A lot of parking had been carved into the curves after that. You can see there are patches of blue in that diagram that don't make sense. It's just people wanted to have their car next to their door entrances. The residential diversity was not great. There were only a couple of buildings that were higher. So it was very monotonous in a way, and wasn't reflective of the population that lived there. The public space was very confusing. These were the front yards, but they also had inner spaces that were really were poorly activated, especially because of the lack of shade. We designed a series of workshops. There were a lot of kids, so we had to design multiple workshops where young people could participate. Really bringing community to talk about specific places, strategies, using tools that seem very simple, but it takes you a whole afternoon to get people on board with the process. People understand space very clearly. They just need ideas, or they need to be guided into what is the role of streets? What is the role of a park? What is a good condition for houses to be together? But everyone was very enthusiastic and understanding the ways that organizing space So these are exercises that are very common for us, thinking of density, thinking of different ways of organizing parks, as central parks, sister parks, 4 villages, community campus. And people understand, we walk away that day with clear ideas that they could understand how they will be represented later. That was very, very interesting to me, to think about, in which ways we can design more and more of these tools to try to understand better space. And of course, we bring it back to the draft board. And our response here was, well, it's very easy. We walk around a lot, and we discovered that the walkability was a main lost aspect. And we started to restore that. Bring in public space in a way that was more intentional around connectivity, and thinking of a typology that was more about creating clusters of neighbors around a central park while activating a closed school that was across one of the main avenues, and having a community building in this central park. Also, people were very proud of the name of the development, which was Buena Vida. It's like a good life. So we wanted to leverage that to celebrate that and created an urban element, a walkable street, a pedestrian street called El Paseo. So we imagine, if this is the corner that you go to today, like what would it look like to have a little bit more density, active storefronts, a street that it's more that has more landscape, that has bike lanes, and a paseo that could have a much more opportunities for identity and activation and kids just running around. So this was a 2-year process, which again, it's a privilege to work in a project for that long, specifically going back multiple times. And the project, it's now under construction. I wish I can go back there. Yeah, it's been a couple of years. So the community was so invested. The authorities, they're very enthusiastic about design, but also the project has won a couple of awards, just recognizing the very, very high level of listening that we did. And the neighbors still they are very proud of their community, and they are on board for change. It's not a small change that's going to happen in their community, right? You saw the diagram has going to be transformed completely, but we always had the support from them because they understood their ideas were the ones driving this process. So that was very, very meaningful to me, not only because it was in the border region, but also because we had time. We weren't rushed to have the community members understand what we were doing. And I think that's very, very important. When you're designing a process, sometimes we have to respond to deadlines, sometimes we have to respond to different timelines, but we're also able to design processes that are more appropriate for the communities that we're working with. If we understand their pace of thinking, their capacity of engagement, we should design for that timeline and advocate for that in the instances that we can adjust. This is another project in Detroit. I collaborated from the distance with this lovely person. We got connected by friends, but I wanted to see what it would look like to work in Detroit. And she was a great partner. Our team was called Double Dutch. This was a call from the Department of Planning in Detroit. Now their commissioner now is our commissioner, Maurice Cox. So we got to meet back then. But our team was called Double Dutch. We were very intentionally playful with it because she in Detroit, me in Chicago, double Dutching files to get this project together. This was in a neighborhood north of east is Detroit, in a neighborhood called Morningside. There was a strategy with a lot of vacant land. The city decided to assemble land that was vacant. Tonica, this is a good reference for us, actually. I'm glad you've seen it. Assemble land to convert it into public space or community gardens, community parks. But the landscape or the urban scape of that neighborhood looked not very different from what I was experiencing in Washington Park a couple of years back. Beautiful buildings, the architecture is incredibly rich and solid. Like, you can see immediately how those buildings can be repurposed and reinvested and reactivated. But a lot of other infrastructure was missing. Like, there were no sidewalks. There were discontinuous sidewalks. But there was a lot of love. This was the place, this was one of the parcels that we were supposed to look at. People had put their chairs, their art. There was a playground that no one used because playgrounds are designed in a very strange way. I hope I have this picture. Yes, kids would rather play in the fence, like having flips going back, as opposed to in the playscapes that they were given. So obviously something was missing, right? It was missing a process. Kids playing in the street when there was a park there. So a lot of non-coherent situations. Once you go there and walk the walk and observe, you understand a place better. There was a lot of art happening in multiple ways, repurposed materials, flowers, a lot of color. So we documented all that. It was important to bring it as part of the conversation. And the Department of Planning organized a meeting in place in the site. And we went with an idea, but we went to ask what else should we know about this place. I think we were more interested. Yes, we brought our observations, but we wanted to know what should happen here. So we came in with an idea of something that could connect all these places together, all these parcels together, but we wanted to know, but just as a prompt for discussion, right? I think it's important to bring creativity, but also have it in a flexible way where people can react to, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, no, that's a terrible idea. I'll tell you why. So it's almost like a provocation. Design, I think, oftentimes is a tool for dialogue. And we brought this idea, this principles, right, of what if you have 4 parcels, how do you make them feel continuous? How do you connect them? This street was a one-way street. And if you know anything about one-way streets, is that cars do not stop. So a lot of accidents have happened there. We needed to slow down and really reclaim that corner, that crossing, that intersection. And each one, at the end of the day, there were 4 different sites. So we wanted to program them differently. Bring them images, image preference, which is very popular in planning. Like, just tell us, what do you think? We wanted to have this. The story of this one was we were convinced they needed a dog park. So the blue dots are for things that people dislike. Look at the dog park. So sometimes you have to put things that simple as a visual to understand preferences. We ask people to tell us, like, where do you want sports court, sitting area, and bring in very, very inviting tools. Like, everyone feels comfortable with the model. Not everyone understands it at once, but once they spend time, they start thinking, oh yeah, I recognize this. This is a good idea. Oh no, this is not a good idea. I just struggle with only drawings in public meetings because only certain people can understand drawings. You have to be trained to understand drawings. Everyone understands words. Most people understand 3-dimensional things. Very few people understand drawings, even though they tell you they do. Safety was a big issue. And we're just documenting all the information. So we ended up with the revised ribbon. We got a lot of more feedback than we thought from the department and the neighbors. But ultimately was this idea of connection, of how do you bring 4 parcels together? How do you bring elements of a ribbon, right? And the top, at the ground level, in the form of furniture. How do you reclaim that intersection and in terms to increase pedestrian safety? So pinching that corner, modifying the curb, but also thinking of strategies for stormwater management. They had a lot of problems with stormwater management, and bring it into the design elements for vegetation to play a role in that, and in a very low cost way. Lighting, obviously, there were missing a lot of issues with lighting. And how can you create things with light that can be more conducive of the concept? In this case, how do we emphasize the path? So the Ribbon Park had 4 areas. Community Mothers Park, that is a park that had all the art that I was mentioning. We wanted to bring like a palette for seasonality. What if all these elements just get transformed over seasons and we get a new palette every time the neighbors come together and make art? Really thinking of what could be, the landscape there was impressive. How can we create more spaces for social, more flexible activities? If you ever talk about bringing a basketball court in a Black neighborhood, mothers are gonna be like, Basketball courts mean trouble. Basketball courts mean teens gathering, and people don't like teens often enough to gather. But the kids were already playing on the street. So we might as well design a sports court where they can play safely in a space that is designed for them. So we compromise. We wanted to bring the sports court, but we wanted to be used by other fitness and physical activity uses. So we disguised, or we thought of a sports court that could be much more flexible, yoga classes, other types of different surface activities. Activate, this was a playground that was already in place, but we reshaped it, reshuffled some of the existing play structures, and we added more active play. We discovered that kids just wanted to jump around, so might as well introduce some elements that do that. So play mounts, some areas for the parents and whoever was watching over the kids to have also somewhere to rest and be engaged visually with the playground. And ecological, we really wanted to bring some of that landscape, some of that vegetation in a less intensive maintenance manner. So creating meadows and perennials and a path that could have this street sitting wall, so increasing the possibilities for resting, being active, or just hanging out. We didn't win, sadly. We were the best voted project, but the committee didn't. We won the popular vote. But the jury prefer another option. Yet I think this image is incredibly memorable for me because it gave me ideas about how just design it's an excuse and an opportunity for gathering, for coming together. And have you ever been to a public meeting? Raise your hand. There's usually, this is the setting, right? Someone's speaking, someone's receiving information. This is a different type of meeting that is in the screen. People were talking to each other about design. Neighbors were talking about the stormwater management and the ribbon and whatnot. So it was really beautiful to see the language, the design language being used by the residents and embraced by them. And it was also really meaningful to me that the design discussion was held in the site where the future park was going to be constructed. So multiple points there, right? Be in place, be in conversation, but also bring design with optimism as a way to engage in discussions. And I think this is the last project I'm going to show today, but this has just kind of been building around the idea of bringing people together, thinking of intention behind design, and bringing creativity. I think often the power of design gets burdened with a lot of issues. And I feel very optimistic. I think optimism is the first aspect that I bring in a lot of work that I do, even though when the challenges seem very big. So when students ask me, I really want to explore this type of work, where do I start? I said, start anywhere. If you feel like making a drawing, having a conversation, doing a little here and there, it's almost starting anywhere. I mentioned already that I'm very invested in mapping. This is one of my favorite pieces ever. All the students that have gone through a class of mine have read The Agency of Mapping, mostly because we do a lot of maps. But it's the idea that mapping is not tracing. Cartography is not necessarily a tool for determination. Maps are a tool for imagination. And that has been demonstrated, right? Imagining how other ways of projecting the world, Buckminster Fuller did it. And I think the idea of imagination, the power of design and imagination shaping the public sphere, for me, is the most exciting thing in the world. Putting things out of place, rotated, bringing content where it doesn't seem to belong, and thinking of other ways of shaking mindsets and influencing perspectives. I think already I misplaced this one. But this is all to talk about this project. When I started Borderless in 2016, I was teaching a summer course at ArchiWorks. And ArchiWorks is an organization that works in social impact. And I had to do something about social impact, right, to teach at that organization. It was much more at the core of what I do anyways, but browsing a little bit what was going on in the city, and this was the first time that I was able to choose something that I wanted to spend my energy researching, designing. I ran across this piece of information that immediately shocked me. And it had already been a couple of years since it happened. In 2013, Chicago closed around 45 public schools due to budget cuts, under-enrollment, and low performance. And I started mapping immediately this. Mapping in the sense of I wanted to understand the dimension of it. I wanted to understand the scale. It was incredibly hard to find concentrated, available data and information. And I just started to aggregating and thinking, just seeing like the patterns of development here. Trying to create a narrative that would get more designers interested in a challenge of a precedent scale. The visuals obviously are very impactful. These are some of the schools in Inglewood that my students recently documented. Bontemps, Woods Academy. Just imagine what it feels like to walk or drive through those schools if you live there. Those were the types of questions, or those were the types of thoughts that were going in my mind when I started working on this documentation project. Started as a documentation project. And as a good designer, I was invited to an exhibition and put a lot of thought and time and energy thinking like, well, yes, the schools are important, but also the public space around them is equally relevant. Can we imagine any types of commons? Especially where the schools were located were neighborhoods that have seen disinvestment for decades. This used to be a commercial corridor. This is what is left in 119 in West Pullman, where the West Pullman school that I showed previously, this incredible building, is located. And I started thinking, yes, the buildings are going to take some time to develop. They're big. But again, what can we do with imagination? And this is where the project Creative Grounds was born. At the intersection of, yes, I'm sure Chicago is going to do a great job revitalizing these buildings. We have gone through more difficult challenges. It will happen in time. But in the meanwhile, how can we play with this idea of the timeline in between? How might our design and architecture create a more inclusive process for repurposing these closed buildings? And just recognizing that this was heavily concentrated in the west and south side, I started to reach out to some of the developers and the organizations that were buying this building. Everything in the back of my head was saying, okay, again, I'm sure they're going to be redeveloped, but everyone thinks about adaptive reuse. Can we think of entrepreneurship and innovation, other ways of learning? How do we activate public life with this, in this 25 neighborhoods where the buildings were shut down? This is my planner brain working in terms of framework. I don't design everything. I design the scaffolding that people if someone sees this, understands what I'm about and what I try to instigate. So sharing, learning, connecting, activating. People understand easier how to connect to a framework than a specific design. And a lot of my students have been part of this project so far in multiple years that has been going on. It started with exhibitions. I started bringing that information to the public in a way that everyone could understand. These are a series of exhibitions, Cultural Center, Jane Addams Whole House on the left. This was our gallery on the 12th floor. But the idea was, how do we bring information in a way that is impactful, that is memorable, and people are curious about learning more? How do we make people care? The little ones were more interested sometimes in reading all this very, very dense information, but because the devices that we were using, the objects that we were designing, had that playfulness into them, so therefore they feel accessible. And we started inventory them. All the schools were being sold, transfer from being a public asset to being a private asset. So we wanted to know what was going on with each one of them, and having, just recording this moment and bringing it as part of our narrative, our collective narrative. How are we thinking of the future of the spaces? Color coding was a strategy to talk about them. The blue ones were immediately repurposed. The magenta ones were sold by the time of the snapshot, and the black ones had remained to be sold. Again, this is a view from 10,000 feet up, right? I was doing all this work, trying to create a public narrative about this, bring in more people to think collectively about this issue. And finally, in one of those calls, reaching out to developers that were buying these buildings, one of them, I explained the idea, what if, is there anything that design can do in the meanwhile that the building gets redeveloped? Said, maybe, yes, let's talk more. And I was really, I wanted to bring attention and awareness to this issue, especially with scale. So I literally put this map that I've been drawing multiple times in my computer in a model, and say, well, what happens if we put this building in the mental map of the city by putting the map of the city in the space of the building? A lot of gatherings, again, a lot of effort, just bringing people together, partners. I don't know how many hours of conversations have had in those spaces, whether it's a walk, it's a discussion in the hallways, it's a Saturday afternoon workshop. And this building is slated to be redeveloped, yet hasn't seen like full redevelopment, but we're keeping it active. So this was the first kind of reaction for me, was creating a map, because that's what I know how to do best. But it became all this series of ancillary events and programs in a way that, bring in more students, learn about the history. So the narrative is no longer mine. The narrative belongs to everyone who has come to this building, and they make a story out of their experience, but also learning that this building represents one piece of the broader challenge. And bringing design, arts, imagination at the forefront of that effort. Again, the school is not still open, yet see all the people that are coming through the classrooms, activate the yard, use the space as a workshop, DJ parties, music. This was our latest summer there. Just, we don't have a lot of furniture, but we have spaces where we can use chalk on the floor, so that's even cooler. Creating projects where anyone can participate. Anyone knows how to hold a brush to paint. This is one of the latest pieces. And just continue to imagine what can happen in a building that beautiful. It is a 1963 Perkins and Will building that was built in tandem with the Robert Taylor homes that no longer exist. So the legacy, or at the time of that design, was this idea of progressiveness about education, flexibility in buildings, and preserving not only the story and the building, but the capacity of community to occupy the space is what drives a lot of this work. How do we make space together, but also hold space for community to come together and think about the future of their spaces? So this is another short video that I want to share.
There's only a few things that impact everyone, right? Parks, beach, lake. The schools is one of those things. It impacts everyone. If you're a kid, if you're an adult. And so when Chicago Public Schools announced that they were closing the schools and then ultimately selling the schools, I thought that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to acquire some pretty incredible real estate, but to have a real impact on community, the same way that a school once did.
We are at former Anthony Overton Elementary School, future of the Overton Business and Technology Incubator. So I started doing research about the closed Chicago Public Schools that closed in 2013, and I thought it was an important call for designers like myself to have a response. The question in place was, if they're not schools anymore, what are they becoming? How can we collectively participate in this process of revitalizing closed schools?
We are big fans of Paola and what she's been doing here at Anthony Overton.
Repurposing the public schools that have been closed and putting them back into practice as a utility for the communities that they live in is really important.
Photographers, civic tech folks, other artists, designers, architects, students, everyone could be represented in this building.
It's really great to see designers, architects, artists working in one space collaboratively.
This school is an architectural gem and absolutely needs to be utilized for some public purpose.
Using this beautiful architecture in the way that the classrooms work with natural light, but also with the visual connectivity across the spaces, give us a really good framework to organize folks to think of their own theme, think of their own focus, but also expressing something that they felt important to talk about in terms of places like schools that are becoming something else.
Just trying to be efficient and effective with materials and, land and our earth. It's a wise thing to do.
That's why this idea of interior architecture, repurposing everything on the inside rather than creating more and more buildings that would eventually become again underutilized.
And I feel like old buildings kind of tell a story that new buildings can't.
A big part of it is just reinvesting in the communities, because these are large vacant buildings and they really need reinvestment just to reactivate the community and make the whole city a better place to live, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. We've been thinking about what it means as architects for us to have a kind of responsibility to our communities and how we can use design to think about bringing people together.
If you work in this project, is walking the talk, is really practicing some activism, and to me that was probably the first time in which I do something like that, and I was like, this is a big opportunity, I have to be part of it.
And being a graduate of the Chicago public school system and being a resident of this community, it's something that I is personal, absolutely.
We really believe that schools are the center of communities and that they're places for neighbors and friends to come together in new ways.
Everyone has the opportunity to make an impact in the built environment if we understand that we have the capacity and the power to do so. Each one of us has that capacity and can be amplified if it's done collectively.
We're sparking fires. I think designers, our ways of advocating are really creating open doors or open door policies in a way that allows people that have something to say that might not get to say it all the time, they now have a space that they can do that.
So that has been, that was 2018. That was the first time that I was able to bring a lot of people invite a lot of people, and a lot of our faculty were very enthusiastic and respond to call. A few guidelines for collaboration, a few themes, but they were really invested. This is last year. Again, I think just when you don't know where to start, just start somewhere, because if you think there's something that you could be improving or recalibrating or adjusting depending of the things that you observe, amazing things happen when you create spaces for community. This is last fall. This was the opening weekend for Chicago Architecture Biennial. They were really interested in showcasing this project. So this is the last video. And this is really amazing, an amazing photo for me to look again, because I came to this building where it was very little activated. And this is last fall. Obviously, right now, this weather, it's not conducive of doing anything outdoors that I love the most, but just seeing how more and more community is able to come and learn about the story, but also share their story and think collectively about the future of our social infrastructure. This is the last video that I'll show today, and then hopefully we'll have some moments for questions.
This week has been a really fascinating process to think how international practices can meet Chicago through the lens and perspective of Bronzeville.
We were definitely interested in specific social questions, and also really aware that our scope and understanding of what was going to be involved or part of the Architecture Biennial was not going to focus primarily on building.
Being in a space that has so much potential, yet a very complicated story.
Strangely, I feel as if Overton was calling us to participate in the Biennial as a venue.
Bringing designers to see a school like Overton Elementary and having them learn and process the story of its closing, yet coming here and collaborating with local students, with other local artists, with other local designers, hear their narratives, exchange. It's been a really interesting way of cross-pollination.
How could we find a kind of reuse of the space that makes sense in the context of not only the biennial, but also in sense of the neighborhood? One thing that I find really interesting about cities is actually a very small percentage of them are actually designed by architects. And so it begs the question of what makes the city, and who makes the city, and how is space produced, and what does it mean to produce space? That's been something that I think is really strong in all of the practices that are here, that they kind of have this will or this desire to kind of make a change, but they understand that that needs to be a kind of collective vision.
The idea was to fill this building up with life again, and with voices, and with noise that used to be here and is not anymore. The first thing you notice is the sound also disappear. So we want to bring it back, and we're working together with a group of kids and young people.
We're recording these sounds in this environment, so it's very site-specific, and that's how we're curating the overtone.
Lots of schools were shut down in Chicago, and what we want to do is make an artistic project to represent the schools that got shut down, and people will come in and actually walk through these and hear our voices. So the final project is that we wanted to spread awareness about all the schools that got shut down.
And it was really important for us to involve the community and the neighborhood here in Bronzeville that surrounds Anthony Overton School. And so Paola had been working really closely with CAPE, and we wanted to involve the students as well, and working closely with the teachers to get them involved in these practices as a process, starting them from the ground up to building and kind of workshopping in the beginning, and then keep going until the final product happens in September as well.
The origin of it goes all the way back to the idea of empowering students and giving them projects in which they can take ownership of. They generally are users instead of actually producers. So this is an opportunity for them to actually produce something that they can say, this is mine.
Enabling them to express some sort of visions that they have about the neighborhood from their own eyes,
They brought us different views from like what they build in different countries and how they work with different children and different ideas and perspectives from other people.
So we truly believe that the architects are not the only makers of the public space, for instance, of the city. Kids are one of the category which is continuously ignored as a valuable group of participating in the city making. Their voices are not heard. Their standpoint over the urban space, over the city, over the memory of the neighborhood. So we have to give them more credit.
First, we build things that can help improve the world. Like yesterday, we was talking about what do we think we need to improve on, and some people was like they need more shelters, more schools, more job opportunities. So today you built your idea.
But it's sort of bringing architecture more to a relatable level for them, that it doesn't take a fancy office and skyscrapers and nice shoes, do you know what I mean? But it's really about solving problems for people, because I think it can like blow their minds, you know, just to be heard.
So here we are like trying to reach neighborhood, trying to understand what their real needs, and trying to search about the memory about the place. We choose this time food as a tool because it helps people to explain their own personal stories. When you ask about them, about their food, so they start to explain their families, their lives.
Yeah, food is actually like an indirect inquiry here to reach people, to understand all the stories behind this environment, this neighborhood. We will do a communal dining all together when we next time come here and try to create more memories of the space.
The map that was designed in the parking lot in many ways was less a technical tool, but it was more an engagement tool to talk about geography and how Chicago has this very dominant tendencies to segregate, underinvest. So the map is basically a tool, and you use that as something that can help you to have a conversation about closed schools, for instance, in this case.
These activation events, it sparks creativity, it sparks the imagination, and so that's a big part of what this was. And obviously the big one this year is leading to the biennial event. Really exciting for us to be one of the host sites, because most of the times when these big important events take place, they take place downtown. And so a lot of times our community kind of feels left out. The biennial this year made a big move by bringing some of downtown into the communities, taking it even a step further by pairing international teams with local teams. And it's incredible to see the designers coming and working with the young students who are a part of the summer program that we had here, or taking them over to Miss Lee's restaurant to, some people would call it soul food, she called it home cooked meals, to see that a team from Turkey had the same kind of home cooked meals that I grew up on 55th Street. All of it, I think, has the impact of showing that the South Side is not so bad. It's not just what you see on the 10 o'clock news, that it is a safe community, that this could be your neighborhood.
Where we go as a society, who do we care for? Like culture and art is basically asking this question, like what kind of world we would like to live in. I think Chicago has been a really great city for me as a practitioner to learn like of the power that an individual can have to impact an environment. Ultimately, the idea is to aim for collectiveness, for something that serves the claimed spaces, that serves the public, that engages community, just sparks imagination in ways that we are not used to in traditional architectural practices.
All you do is take one person to speak up and to have people to come out and to help your community out, really. And I just really like working on this project to actually spread awareness of all the schools that have been shutting down and having people actually know what's actually going on.
Everyone has a voice, and that everyone is equal, and everyone has a power within their art to show how it affects them and people around them.
There is always a group of people who are dedicated to fighting for what they believe is their right to live. Chicago, in that regard, people are sort of so dedicated to making a sort of shift or a change in the way that they live. So I hope that through the Chicago Architecture Biennial, there'll be an opportunity to look at those practices in more detail, how architects and architecture plays such a big role within the social makeup of a city.
Again, all these videos are publicly available. I really enjoy. We've been doing things in the classroom, trying things in other schools. This was in collaboration with Tunica and her organization, Inglewood. But I think we're also, I think I enjoy, a part that I really enjoy about this project is documenting other people's voices and bringing those voices to other publics. So I hope you enjoy that as well, learning about these different stories and seeing from my perspective how I've been trying to do it. So when you don't know where to start, just start anywhere. Thank you. I think we have a few moments for questions if you are curious about anything. If you don't have plans for this summer, I would say we'll always recruiting for Overton and other closed school sites. But also, I'm teaching a class right now dedicated to this. So we're going there tomorrow with this weather. But, it's always engaging and fun. Anyone? No hands? Go ahead. Do you need a mic? Okay. Oh, there's one coming on the back so everyone can hear you.
Thanks, Paola. This is a great lecture. The issue of when you're trying to engage a community with any kind of design or plan.
Can you hold it closer?
Yeah, when you're trying to engage a community with any kind of intervention or planning, can you talk a bit about you mentioned it briefly, but I thought it was very good if you could expand about working with a community in their time and in their pace.
Yeah. So I can talk from two fronts of action, right? I mean, I'm a practicing urban planner, so I do this for consulting. And what we try to do is when you have public engagement meetings, you just don't do one. That's like mistake number one. You only give people one chance, but also you don't do it in the time frame that no one's going to come. So understanding people's dynamics and schedules and the places that they're more comfortable going. Do they need activities for their kids to do while the adults are here? Do we need to design activities or ways of engagement for youth? Like all that comes into play, and it's not there's not a recipe per se. You just have to know. You have to ask the question. Okay, how are we going to engage the most people possible? We need to understand what they're doing in their daily lives, and also not designing for one moment where you can come and. This is the information. It's overwhelming. If you go to any of these planning processes, the boards are just so dense and like incredibly difficult to understand sometimes. I'm a slow thinker and I process very slowly, so I need a lot of time to process information. I think in many cases, people need that chance multiple times. So pop-up galleries, we've been doing that a lot in storefronts that are not utilized. We talk to owners and activate spaces that are not being utilized as retail spaces into planning spaces that eventually become community spaces because people like to come together to talk about the future of the places they live. So that those have been legacy projects and other or legacy aspects that and other projects that we've been working on. But for Overton, it's I think what I try to do in a much more flexible agenda, it has to do with making it a time you want to spend with people, with new people you want to meet. So we call them like hangouts. Those circles in the yard of Overton are a hangout, and you get to meet new people. A lot of the collaborations that have emerged that in that building is because people are walking in the hallways and they just want to know about each other's work and they end up working together. But I think the approach to a lot of this work is you can't do it just once. It just has to be inflexible, and the expectations need to be just lower. Like, why do we need to produce in the time frames that we are asked to do it? So a lot of these projects are sometimes are presented. We have deadlines, of course, but I think the most important part is to have just an excuse and an opportunity to meet with neighbors. So a lot of hangout space and spaces where people can learn something new. I get that a lot. Like, I didn't know about this, and people keep coming back. So I think when we offer opportunities for communities to learn something new, they will always be interested. People are always curious about things. So that's my approach, like always having some things accessible, responsive, but also there are an opportunity to learn something new or to know someone new. There are a couple of hands, one on the back, one over here.
You spoke about barriers earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and how language is one of them. Also in the video, somebody speaks about using food as a way to get to know the community members. And so how do you craft that language, and how do you craft that technique to provoke creativity
Mm-hmm.
coming from one side to another?
So we have multiple, like every time I'm designing a process, I usually just spend a lot of time talking to people one-on-one or in small groups and asking questions. Food by excellence is always going to be a good gather. So a lot of the projects, a lot of the meetings that we do is around food, potlucks, but also, I mean, just like as one of the team members mentioned, like food is an indirect inquiry, right? It's just the excuse, it's the opportunity. But just thinking of, you know, do you create a mode of conversation where you can actually have a dialogue? So again, big spaces for meetings are for me very difficult because you can probably talk to one person or two. When you're in a circle, when you're in a group of 20 people, you can actually engage in dialogue directly. So it's thinking of the scale, and it's thinking the type of conversation dialogue you have to enable, or you want to enable. Sometimes, you know, sometimes I have a prompt. Sometimes we have to get things done and we have an agenda, but oftentimes because of the feeling of our meetings, people bring other content, and that for me, that's the most interesting. Talking about, you know, the way that space makes them feel, or, you know, people that took 2-3 meetings to share a story. Just because the way that we design environments, the way we design gatherings, enables or completely blocks this type of capacity of sharing. So I just like being very open and transparent. I come to these meetings often and say, I am organizing. Again, I'm not trained as an organizer, but I'm trying. So I'm very, very upfront with the things that I'm good at and the things that I'm not so good at. And I ask for people's patience and, you know, and just trust. Like, just trust me, this is for a good reason. I'm not sure 100% this is going to work, but just bear with me and engage in this process. So just communicating that sometimes helps people to relax and have a different type of attitude. Yeah. It was one question on the back. Over there, on the corner of the room.
Hi. My question is, starting with documentation of the schools till the end result of having a successful impact, did CPS get involved in any phase of that project?
No, but you know, you never know where projects are going to take you. So this project has given my practice a lot of visibility. I engaged recently with Janice Jackson, the CEO of CPS. This is 3 years after, right? I've been working on this for multiple series of reasons. The previous administration didn't really want to talk about it. This administration is doing the opposite, really want to talk about it, but don't knowing where to start. So I slowly have been able to engage with this content, being able to advocate for what I think a more just process should be. And the big ambition here is to turn it into policy. Like, how do we do this in a way that we know maybe schools are going to continue to close in the future? Spaces and buildings transition function all the time. The question is not the if, it's the how. So if we create a policy around, these buildings should not be disposed immediately, should not be disposed this way, it should not be disposed business as usual, what would that process look like? That's what a policy can do and make sure we don't have border buildings again like the ones I show you. But that requires understanding, political processes. I'm a practicing planner, not by training, so I'm still learning a lot of my ways around, how do you write policy? And most importantly, who do you collaborate to do that? So I've been immersing myself for the last year in understanding that better through fellowships, through partnerships, and connecting with the city of Chicago in multiple departments. So, and that's work that doesn't make it to the slides. A lot of meetings, a lot of training, a lot of conversations. But it's important work, and that's part of the civicness aspect that as a value that I was talking about in the beginning, right? In order to be part of these processes, we have to invest in being part of those conversations, being part of the outreach, being part of, hey, alderman, or hey, City of Chicago public official, I want to talk about that. If we understand we have a role in understanding how our communities are built, that just takes time and investment. And I think reclaiming that or claiming that capacity is part of what I'm trying to also inspire others to do. Not only the design in the design field, but everyone that I get to interact with. And learning from other people, to collaborating with Turika Johnson and the front line here I've been learning from her probably as much as from other people, but just working on side by side with people that you trust, I think that's something that it's important to invest in any stage of your career. I don't see any hands. Oh, one more, sorry.
And I have the mic.
And I need any prescription or more light back there.
Just kind of a follow-up on that. So, as you say, you need to find people you trust, etc. I was just wondering, you said designing with, how do you find those people? How do you find the right people?
It's almost like asking, how do you find love? I don't know. That's a very philosophical question. You have to meet, 100 people. And, I believe the best way of knowing people is working with them. I think working side by side with people, you understand their work ethic, their ambitions, their agendas, their investment, their interests, their issues, their concerns, their limitations, their capacities. You don't discover that just by talking with people. You have to work with them. So I think that's important. Just invest in the process of going through a project with someone. You'll learn tons of more things that you would know, that you will learn just by speaking with them. Walk the talk in other ways. So it's 7:30. I don't see any more hands, but I want to say thank you. I'm really thankful of all of you listening for an hour and a half. Anything else, Henny, you want to? No? Closing? Okay, thank you very much. Have a good night. We stay tuned for Overton adventures this summer.